Chapter 11. After Dan had eaten a soup, a tossed salad and a roll with butter, he felt as full as if he had eaten a 5-course meal. Heath had left shortly afterward to prepare dinner for tonight before he would come back to fetch Dan and Malou and bring them home. Dan had freshened up in the small washroom adjacent to the room, had slipped into his jeans and t-shirt, ready to take a walk around the ward, such as Dr. Sanders had recommended for him to do. Malou was walking with Dan down the corridors, crisscrossing the floor, when she asked, "Are you sure you'll be okay walking on your own after we leave the hospital?" Truth be told, Malou didn't know where that question came from and switched her gaze up to her husband. Dan turned his head to her, taken aback. "Why would I have to walk alone anywhere, hun? Aren't you going to the drugstore with me?" "It's not that, sweetheart. It's because I'm afraid the fresh air outside might be too much for you." Dan stopped. "Listen to me, Malou. Don't worry about me. I'll be fine. Fresh air or searing heat won't matter once I'm finally out of here, but I'm counting on you to be right here beside me, the two of us holding hands when we get to that sidewalk. Remember, we've got to hold hands to return to Pahokee." "Yes, I remember, sweetheart," Malou said, resuming their walking around the hallways, "but I'm afraid that we might get separated somehow. Call it woman's tuition, if you like, but I don't like things being so easy." Dan smiled. "I'd like you to feel the way I feel right now, and I'm sure you'd change your mind then, about this being too easy." "I know, honey, but you remember that Damien said, don't you?" Dan nodded. "He's told me to remember that he can speak to my thoughts, and that's what I'm afraid of. That cat is really a devil. Not perhaps the devil himself, but he's the influential party in all of this. He wants us to fall on the side of evil and guide us to hell, and that's something I will not let him do to us." The determination in Dan's voice left no doubt in Malou's mind that Damienos was in for a heap of trouble if he tried any of his dirty tricks on either or both of them. At around 5 o'clock, Dan and Malou were ready to leave the hospital. After saying goodbye to Natalie and Dr. Sanders, who wished them well, they went down the elevators. Dan could not zip up his jacket since his right arm was still in a sling, but he held the tips of the anorak together with his left hand when they went through the sliding doors. Heath, who had been waiting for them in the front of the exit, got out the driver's side, rounded the car, and after giving his cousin a hug, opened the passenger and rear doors for them. "Wow, my car has never looked and smelt so clean," Dan said, trying to grab the seatbelt on his right side. "That's because I got your babe through the car wash and took out all the crap she'd been carrying for all these months," Heath replied, smiling at Dan. After Malou had helped her husband with his seatbelt and had settled in the back seat, Heath turned on the ignition and pulled the car from the curb with ease. The drive home was uneventful, and that bothered Malou no end. She was expecting to see Damienos appear round every corner or at any intersection when the car had to slow down and stop for the lights. Although she knew her dreamcatcher was going to protect her, she was still terrified of her thoughts being invaded by the cat. When Heath pulled into the driveway and the three of them got out of the car, something that Malou had not expected happened. She saw her husband turn from the door of their home and walk in the opposite direction. When she called to him, he didn't reply. She ran after him and tried grabbing his left hand, but it felt as if she had touched the hand of a mannequin. She then took a step to come to stand in front of him, but he pushed past her. Heath came hurrying down the hill after Dan and tried to stop his defensive stride toward the sidewalk and the street beyond, to no avail. "What's the matter with you, man?" Heath yelled to his cousin's face. "Where are you going?" "Stop him before he gets to the street," Malou cried out behind the two men. "It's probably the side effects from the drug." Dan was already on the sidewalk when Malou caught up with him and Heath, who was trying to stop his cousin from stepping into the rush hour traffic. She pushed Heath aside, stood in front of Dan again, and with one hand on her dreamcatcher, she slapped his face hard with the other. Dan shook his head, looked down at his wife with the eyes of someone who had just woken up from a bad dream. "What am I doing here?" he blurted when he realized where he was standing. "You've been going for walkies," Malou replied, giggling nervously and grabbing him by the arm to lead him toward the house once again. "What do you mean, walkies?" Dan asked, still dazed. "Well, we just came out of the car and you started walking down the hill like a zombie out of some cemetery or something," Heath put in. "That must have been some drug that jerk gave you." By this time, the three kids had come out of the house and were now running toward their mum and dad, all smiles. "Where were you going, Dad?" Stefano asked. "We saw you through the window, and then you didn't want to stop for Uncle Heath. What's going on, Dad?" "It's nothing, Stefano," Malou replied while she lifted Gabby into her arms. "It's because Dad was given some bad drugs when he was in the hospital, so he goes for walkies sometimes, but he'll be okay very soon, I promise." "What kind of drugs?" Daniel demanded, looking from his mum to his dad in turn. "Is it like the drugs they sell in the streets, like they say on the news?" "Don't be silly, Daniel," Stefano said. "The hospital don't give drugs like that to people." "Okay, kids," Heath put in. "Let's get in the house. I've got 2 humongous pizzas waiting to be baked." "Oh, wow," Stefano exclaimed. "Can't wait," rushing indoors with his brother in tow. A few hours later, after everyone had settled in front of the television and the kids were already in bed, Dante and Heath decided to leave the couple alone and retired to the family room downstairs to play cards and watch the late news before going to bed themselves. When everything was quiet around the house, Malou and Dan decided it was time for the two of them to drive to the drugstore and go back to Pahokee. They only had 2 hours before midnight. After the clock would strike 12, it would be too late. Malou slipped in behind the wheel of Dan's car while Dan settled in the passenger seat. They kissed feverishly before Malou turned on the ignition. As soon as they were on the road, Malou asked, "Do you remember where you went when we got home this afternoon?" "Oh yes," Dan replied. "It's not like something I'm likely to forget." "Were you in Pahokee?" "No, it was nothing like what you saw in Florida, actually." "Do you know where it was then?" "Not exactly. It was like an endless desert. The sand was hot and golden brown with dunes as high as mountains." As Dan began describing where he had gone that afternoon, the picture of the desert slowly invaded Malou's mind. Within seconds, she too was walking through that Sahara landscape with Dan at her side. There was nothing in front, behind, or surrounding them but dunes of sand. "Dan, where are we?" Malou asked, grabbing his hand. "Where did Damiano said we would find the oasis?" "Only a few more miles, Malou. It's not too far now." Dressed in ragged clothes and a scarf surrounding each of their heads, the couple seemed to be walking aimlessly toward an oasis where a lake and palm trees would welcome them back to reality, or so they hoped. Dan's arm was not in a sling anymore, and Malou noticed that he no longer had any bandages around his torso. That's when she stopped and touched her dream catcher. When she came to, she looked beside her. Dan was gone. "Oh no!" she shouted inside the empty car. She was still on the road, but had fortunately stopped instinctively by the curbside when she had begun envisaging the desert where Dan had lost himself. Touching her dream catcher, Malou began calling Dan's name in the hope he would hear her voice, such as he did when he was in a coma. "Please, honey, please, listen to me. Touch your dream catcher. Touch it and think about me and the children." She screamed between sobs. "You need me, sweetheart. Please let it go. Come back to me. What am I supposed to do?" Malou then looked at the grey sky behind the windshield and put her head down against the wheel, crying her heart out. Meanwhile, Dan continued to walk toward an oasis which Damianos had described in his mind. "Hello, Dan," Damianos said, suddenly appearing in front of him. "How are you feeling?" "Damn you, Damianos. Where is Okeechobee Lake? You said I would find it around here. You've got me walking in this bloody desert for hours now." "Where would you rather walk? In the jungle, perhaps?" "That would make for a nice change," Dan replied, chuckling, sarcasm dripping from his voice. "Well, your wish is my command," Damianos said, changing the spectacle around Dan instantly into a stifling jungle where Dan's progress was hindered now by overgrown lianas descending from tall trees and a floor of moss squishing under his steps. "If you only had the guts to show yourself, you bastard, I'd throttle you," Dan erupted, jutting his clenched fist in the air. "Ha! Menaces. They won't get you anywhere, and if it's my present you require, here I am," Damiano said as he came to stand before Dan, eyes blazing. He had taken the shape of a black puma, staring at his prey and growling. Dan began laughing. "I always knew you couldn't stay away from being the cat you always were, Damianos. And you think because this is only a design in your mind that I couldn't make mincemeat out of your appetizing flesh, do you? Not at all, but I believe you're wasting time with your games right now. You don't want me or Malou to return to Pahokee." "But why?" "That's for me to know and for you to find out. If you ever live that long, my dear Dan, thanks to the myristicin, you're now in my power. The antidote was good enough to return your body functions to normal, and it had no effect on your mind, fortunately." "So what you're saying is that I'm like a druggie, is that it?" "Well, let's just say that you're more of a drug addict. You're now on the road to perdition." "But that's not what you promised. You said you would take me and Malou back to Pahokee." "Oh, my, what are promises between enemies, Dan, if nothing more than taunting lies? So where am I supposed to go now?" "To hell," Damianos declared between nasty chuckles as the puma disappeared from sight.